Hello, viewers. I'm Vibhuti Jha, and this is Jaipur Dialogue USA. As always, I request you to like, subscribe, and share our channel. Give your feedback, and we appreciate your feedback just as always. Now, today I wanted to talk about a very specific topic, considering what is happening in the world around us in relation to specifically the Islamic way of life. Now we know that Yahya Sanir, or whatever that name was, Hamas chief, was eliminated. So Hamas and Hezbollah hierarchy has been dismantled by Israeli response to the challenge, the existential challenge that Jews and Israel faces in that part of the world. In India as well, Islam has a major conflict with Hindus and the rest of the people. Everywhere they are demanding, to use the proverbial language, their own pound of flesh. Today, I have a great pleasure in welcoming to talk about this very specific matter, Mr. Rahul Sur, who some of the viewers of Jaipur Dialogue would know that he has been on our show. He has done a deep research. He's a researcher and a scholar in Islam as a theology, Islam as a practicing belief. And he's done a human service to people. So he was also a very senior UN employee and also IPS and very senior officer in the Maharashtra cadre of Indian Police Service. We are going to talk about this matter on several levels: conceptual level and the applicability of the faith in a case of mutual coexistence. We all live in the world together. So Rahulji, welcome to this show. And thank you very much for joining today. And what I wanted to do is that basically we not need to talk about this. Compatibility is a big word. For mutual coexistence, compatibility becomes a big word. And as we go forward, we will also examine how things are actually shaping up in this direction. Rahulji, go ahead.
Namaste, Vibhuti Ji. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate an opportunity to be here with you. And many thanks to your viewers also for joining in. As you said, we appreciate their feedback. So in terms of the broad issue which we have raised, what I'd like to talk about is the issue of Islam and democracy, if I have your permission.
Yes, please.
And in that sense, this issue can be looked at from several ways: the conceptual way, the practical way, and patterns of democracy in Islamic countries around the world. But when we are considering, Islam and democracy, we need to start that discussion with two statements. One is that, according to the United Nations, criticism of Islam, its ideas, its symbols, and leaders is not in itself Islamophobic, number one. Number two, that what I'm going to be saying, I have adopted as an objective criteria the norms and the conventions which have been adopted by the international community, especially in terms of the human rights, rights of women, rights of children. And therefore, the opinions are going to be based upon this objective criteria which lies outside me and are accepted by the international community. So with those two things out of the way, let's examine what is the compatibility between Islam and democracy at the conceptual level. And to examine that, what I propose is a small fictional car journey. Imagine there is a car called Islam, called democracy. And in that car are seated 5 persons. There is a Muslim man, his wife, his 2 children. The daughter is 13, the son is 10, along with a young Christian friend, lady, who's wearing a cross. So they discuss amongst themselves and say, what shall we try today? And they said, well, let's try democracy. So where do we find democracy? And they find a big road called Highway Islam. And they steer towards that, and the car has got democracy written right across it. So as they're entering it through the toll, the man at the toll stops them. He's a conservative man with a flowing beard, and he hands them a piece of paper. And he says, you know that our religion is a complete code of life. It is political, social, economic, cultural, ethical, sexual. You name it, our religion has the solution for all the problems of modern life. So they say, that's great, let's go. And he says, well, as you're going down this, if you have any problems, if you have any doubts, give me a call and I'll solve them. That's fine. So the car starts on its journey. And sure enough, as what happens quite frequently, the children start fighting amongst themselves. There is one video game in the car, and the fight between the children is who is going to have that video game. The children fight amongst themselves and they scream the car down, and therefore exasperated, the wife tells her husband, why don't you phone that guy who said that he will have a solution? So he phones him up. He says, look, this is the problem. And he says, simple, just give it to the boy. And he says, no, but my daughter is elder. He says, no, in our religion, the man always comes first. Okay. The issue is resolved. The girl starts sulking. She goes to sleep. And after some time, they come to a rest stop where they go inside. When they go inside, the Christian woman has got a cross. And the man behind the counter, who's got a photograph of his wife and children out there, says, well, I really don't like that. And he says, why? And he says, is she your friend? He says, yeah. The driver says, yes. He says, well, in our religion, we are not supposed to make friends with Christians and Jews. Again, disappointed, all of them get back into the car and start driving again. 50 miles down the road, again, they come across a rest stop. They go inside. And they come outside and say, hey, there is a nice playground and let's start playing a frisbee. So all of them start playing a frisbee, the boy and the girl. And from inside, suddenly a man comes running out and says, no, women cannot play sports because men are looking. So again, very disappointed, they get back into the car and start again. Inside the car, the driver gets a call. And this is the same guy who's place they had stopped first. And he said, well, you know what? He wants to marry you. She says, but how can I marry him? I saw the picture of his wife and his children on the counter. He says, that doesn't matter. We allowed four wives. And finally, after some time, again, there's a very contemplative mood inside the car, and they go on and they come to a final stop, which seems like a bookshop. The man goes inside and says, look, I'm looking for some light material to read. And he looks around all the bookshelves and he finds there are only religious books. He says, don't you have any other books? He says, no, because our religious books contain all the knowledge which is required in us. And therefore they get off again, very pensive and contemplative, and there is silence inside the car. But the man phones up the guy who had met at the toll tax and says, well, is there any other way we can have a little bit of more democracy in Islam? He says, no. I told you we are a complete code of life, political, social, economic. And if you decide to get democracy in Islam, that is what you will get. So therefore, the moral of the small story is there is an irreconcilable opposition at the conceptual level between Islam and democracy as it is practiced, Vibhuti Ji.
The irreconcilable difference, and you give a very, very simple and nice example of a car and a few people in the car. It is indeed amusing that when you talk about compatibility, there is no respect or regard for anybody else other than the diktats of the book. So the question then arises that there was an Arab Spring to bring about democracy. The Western world talks about democracy, democracy, democracy everywhere. Those people will shout about freedom and azadi and all that kind of stuff. But so what is the actual state of democracy in countries that are of Islamic origin? Do they actually practice democracy for non-Islamic people in their countries or for themselves? So there are many countries who are talking about it. Your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very valid question. And, from the conceptual level, I think it's necessary to go to the practical level, as you said, Vibhuti Ji. And to answer the question, I think that we should take this issue region by region. So let's start with the part of the world where Islam was born, and that is the Middle East, the Arab world. And the Arab world is a striking anomaly in the globalization of democracy because all the regimes in the Arab world are authoritarian. Uh, Again, to delve a little bit more into it, you will remember that in 2010, when the Arab Spring had broken out, with the immolation of a street vendor, which had sparked revolt in Arab countries from the street, that this was met with a very heavy hand from the governing coalitions and rulers of the time. And over time, we know that the Arab Spring has been completely snuffed out. And the only country which had a semblance of democracy, which they said, well, it has progressed to a free democracy, Tunisia, has now gone back to its authoritarian ways. So therefore, in ground zero in the Arab world, there is no democracy. Now, let's come to the next region. That is North Africa. Here too, the situation is quite bad, and almost all of them are authoritarian regimes. There have been some concessions to democracies in the forms of regular elections to legislators, but at the same time, the supreme power in, just a moment, I have a call coming. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. The supreme power in these countries remains with the ruling person. We have seen what is going on in Libya. They've had a civil war. Sudan is in a civil war. Somalia, the same situation. So therefore, when we come to the state of democracy in the Middle East and North Africa, it's pretty much a washout. Let's come to the next region, that is Asia. And here I divided it into two parts. One is Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Central Asia, we have the five stands. That is, we have Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. All of them are former parts of the Soviet Union, and they are now considered to have universally authoritarian regimes. And the term which academics use for it is sultanistic regimes. In other words, they are personal dictatorships in which the president really wields absolute power. Coming to South Asia, well, we know that India is a vibrant democracy, the most vibrant democracy in the world, bar none. But the situation in Pakistan and Bangladesh is something which we are quite aware of in terms of democracy over the years. Pakistan has had a history of being ruled by dictators in the army with small periods of sham democracy, as well as Bangladesh, which also has had a very tumultuous and a very bloody past in which, assassinations galore. So the state of democracy in these two countries is rather powerless and rather feeble, and therefore they confront all the issues which I talked about in my example of the card, that is the rights of the minorities, of women, freedom of speech, etc. Coming to the last part, that is Southeast Asia, that is Indonesia and Malaysia, these two countries seem to be slightly more democratic, and the Western world always likes to refer to them as moderate Islam, and therefore they're held as an example for the whole world. It is true that they are more democratic, although they have authoritarian tendencies, and there is a lack of civilian control over the military. But at the same time, if they are indeed more democratic, then I think it is a valid question to ask whether the cultural imprint of the Hindu civilization in Southeast Asia has something to do with the more peaceful nature. So overall, if you have a look at the global tour of democracy in the Islamic world, I would say that democracy is a plant which finds very little sustenance in the rather hardy soil of Islam when it comes to flourishing.
That's a very wonderful, quick snap of the state of democracy in Islamic way of life. Now the question then arises, why do we have so many Islamic people coming to the Western countries and democracies? And as if the democracies of the West and India and the likes, it seems as if they have the sole responsibility to tolerate a belief and accept a belief and let them flourish in our countries with their ideology, which is totally incompatible. How would you relate this bending backwards attitude of the Western democracies and India, where we try to appease and pander and try to mollify them to our way of life, not realizing or ignoring the actual reality of their way of life? So there is a total incompatibility on that. They all demand their way of life in every European country, in America, in India. Yet we democratic countries are bending backwards. What is it that allows us or makes us do that? I'm reminded of Einstein's famous saying that we are trying to appease and pander to the same point, expecting different results, which is not going to happen. So why are we in such a state of delusion?
So I think that there is a confusion about the idea of equality and tolerance, which has led to this rather sorry state of affairs. Here, I'd just like to point out that there's a very famous concept called Karl Popper's The Paradox of Tolerance, which you might have heard of it. And it essentially goes like this. That is, to what extent is tolerance bound to tolerate intolerance? That's the theoretical question. And it says that if tolerance continuously keeps on tolerating intolerance, then the day will come when the intolerant will overpower the tolerant, therefore putting an end to it once and for all. And consequently, it requires that the tolerant must be intolerant of the intolerant if tolerance is to survive. It is a convoluted argument, but essentially it says that, look, you are not bound to be tolerant to the extent of letting your societies, destruct under external influences. So in the case of, the migrants of this particular religion in Western countries, the causes for the attitude towards them can be one. There is a very, very strong connection between these Islamists and the leftists, and consequently, they have a very strong protector in them, which is loath to cast any critical eye, no matter how mild, on them. Secondly is, if you look at writers like Douglas Murray, according to him, there is a civilizational, the West feels that its days are over, that it is guilty for its colonial past, and consequently it is bound to have some kind of reparations by letting them in unlimited numbers. But at the same time, this is not going to end well, because this has been an important conversation about a very important issue, which has not really been had, honestly, either in the media or in the political elites, with the result that there is a widening fissure of political parties in the West over this issue.
Right now, we have seen India has gone through an election, 2024. US is going through an election in the next few days. And we have had UK gone through an election, and the rest of the world is also having from place to place. What emerges to me is to take the Indian example first, that despite the massive effort by Prime Minister Modi to be inclusive, sabka saath, sabka vikas, sabka vishwas, sabka prayas, the famous slogan for which he has been really hit hard by the Hindu voters. And you're looking at America. Very interestingly enough, I came across that the Pakistanis have endorsed Mr. Trump. It is a public document now. The Pakistan American Muslims have endorsed Mr. Trump, whereas politically they have always been voting Democrats, and now they are trying to team up with Trump. So what is the voting pattern there? What are they expecting Trump will do or veer away from his professed policies that he has publicly announced? What are the Pakistani Americans trying to gain? And that also brings about that in India, 80% or more voted for non-Hindu party, that is BJP and Modi, despite significant amount of economic development happened in their communities. So much so that Hindus were annoyed that he has done more for Muslims than he has cared for Hindus. So there is a very interesting thing that I feel that the Muslims have recognized that voting pattern is the key element to assert your right or make your claims. How do you find this shaping up in America, in the rest of the world? Because they, again, by being a vote bank, they influence the elections.
Right.
France, the rest of the Europe is going through that dilemma. Talk to us about that, please.
Right. So that's again a very broad question, and I think we can break it down into parts. One is that as we have seen that democracy is a plant which really finds very hard to implant itself in the Islamic world. But when we come to the large number of immigrants of the Islamic faith in Western Europe and in America, we see, and even in India, we see certain striking patterns of continuity in their voting behavior. And the first element of that is that they are strongly aligned to the parties of the left. For instance, in the UK, in the 2019 election, Labour got, I think, more than 80% of the Muslim votes. And in this election, their share had gone down because they were annoyed with the Labour stand on events in Israel and Gaza. In France, it is the same situation where they have voted strongly for the leftist party headed by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. In Germany, it is also the same thing. And in America, they have been aligned with the Democratic parties. In India, the Congress is very heavily dependent upon the Muslim vote, as they cast themselves as the sole saviors. But in the case of what is happening in America, it is not really sure, but it also could be a shrewd bet on the part of American Muslims to align themselves who they see as possibly the winning horse, and therefore make sure that they have a foot in the door or a place at the bargaining table to mollify or to reduce the severity of his policies. So that is something which we will see how it really pans out. But one more aspect which I wanted to tell you and your viewers is that in all these Western countries, in addition to the adhesion of the Muslim vote for the leftist parties, there is also the emergence of Muslim-only parties. For example, in Netherlands, you have the Dawa party, right? It calls itself diversity, etc., etc., but Dawa is an Islamic term for an invitation to Islam, which is considered a meritorious act. There is also a party called NIDA, I think either it's Germany or Netherlands, which again is the call. In the UK, in the recent elections, they had it was the Muslim vote. So basically, they had organized themselves only on the basis of their political religious identity. And they are also doing the same thing in Australia. So therefore, the pattern which I'm trying to point out to you, Vibhuti Ji, is an alliance of the Muslim vote with the leftist parties, and B, incipient attempts or beginning attempts at forming Muslim-only parties, in which the defining characteristic is there is a preoccupation with what they see as a violation of Muslim rights in non-Muslim countries, but never the contrary. There is never any talk about the violation of non-Muslim rights in Muslim countries. Hence, there is very little reciprocity. So basically, that is what I think is my answer to your question.
Thank you very much. Now, you use the word reciprocity, and that word is my favorite word, because for toleration, as you very rightly mentioned, toleration is a negative word in my impression, because it is like acceptance on a no-choice basis. But if we talk about acceptance and respect, that's missing in Islamic ideology. The acceptance and respect is only if you subscribe to their point of view. We have seen it happen in India, where the entire Kashmiri Pandit and entire Kashmir, they gave the clarion call, the shameful, shameless call to all Hindus to leave convert or die. And that theology remains everywhere. So the question is very important for us to answer, that will the entire democratic world be able to persuade them to use the word acceptance and respect for everybody, all humans and all life forms, rather than subscribing to their point of view, because they are understanding the political game play very well in democracies. And that's what is critical, because they resort to vote bank politics, and they also resort, unfortunately, to violence as their element of negotiation. So, as we know in Hamas doctrine, they are always committed to, the preamble itself says, destruction of Jews in Israel. And they also say, one of their 32-page document, one of the articles 16 or 17 clearly states there will be no negotiated settlement with these fellows. So what are we negotiating for? Are we barking up the wrong tree, or are we expecting a miracle where there is no likelihood of a miracle?
So I think, Vibhuti, I'm actually very sorry to be, pessimistic about this, but I think that if you have a look at the religious norms which are involved, I do not see any solution in the short and the medium term future. And let me tell you why. Now, there is a book I was reading recently on. This was on Pakistan. It was written by Pakistani, experts. It's called Faith-Based Violence and Deobandi Militancy in Pakistan. And one of the persons in that is a guy called Pervez Hoodboy, who is a relatively liberal Pakistani intellectual. And he has a chapter in the book which is called, Could Pakistan Have Been Pluralistic? In other words, his argument is that Pakistan has failed to be a pluralistic state. And in this chapter, he asks a very interesting question. He says, we must look at the fundamentals of this religion. And he says there are three aspects which require unanimous consent because they are a fundamental part of a religion. One is, zimmi, and the other is the fact that you have to pay the jizya, and the third is breaking of idols, bhut shikini, as he calls it. And he quotes a conservative Muslim cleric that these are fundamental aspects, and says these are the things which are driving behavior in Pakistan. Now, these are fundamental parts of the religion, and I do not see how this issue is going to go forward, especially when it's not a bug, it's a feature. That is, you are committed to the superiority, of your religion and of its spread through various means. And consequently, I have a very little faith in the future in terms of a positive outcome on this. I see a very, very long, a protracted struggle ahead in this, with a lot of conceptual confusion and a lot of, side reasons being thrown around, but not really acknowledging the real drivers of the conflict.
Now, that is, I won't say pessimistic, I would say a realistic assessment. When something is happening, unless and until we take a realistic thought process then we can't, unless we do a realistic analysis, we can't have a solution to the problem. So forget about the short term and the medium term. As the saying goes, in the long run, we all are dead. So the question is, how does the whole thing play out in the short and the medium term? Because we are looking at only conflict coming from them in our societies. They migrate to our societies, West or India or anywhere else. They don't accommodate those tendencies in their country. There are 57 countries in the world that are Islamic. Mm-hmm. They won't accept the Rohingyas. They won't accept anything else. And that's what is a very dangerous situation, because we value human rights. We value life. They don't. For them, human right is only if you subscribe to our point of view. So if it is an irreconcilable difference, what is the expectation of the general world around us with reference to freedom of religion and freedom of speech? We have none in their dispensation. So how can that be brought together? And what must be done for that?
again, as I said, it's a very, very difficult situation, and I don't see any, easy way out, and I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. The conflict seems to be getting deeper and more pervasive. Now, you see, there is also the issue of what we call as the struggle within Islam. And now that is important to your issue because you've talked about, what can possibly, happen in the future. And many, many academicians and scholars have talked about what they call the struggle within Islam, and that we have come across terms such as radical Islam, political Islam, jihadis, fundamentalists, Salafis, all the terms. And then we also have terms like, moderate Islam, uh, you know, uh, peaceful Muslims. And these are all actually various facets of describing the many, many undercurrents which are at play in the Muslim world. Now, when I was looking at this in a conceptual manner, I have now, come up with a new conceptual way of looking at it, which I wanted to share with you and your viewers, which is called Islamostat. Now, Islamostat is a word which is derived from the word thermostat, which means that obviously you can adjust the temperature up and down based on the thermostat. And similarly, that means the word Islamostat implies the degree of literal compliance with Islam. It means that the Islamostat of a country is higher. So the more the adherence, the higher or the temperature of the country, the higher the Islamostat on a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. Let me give you an example of 3, 4 countries. Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country which calls itself the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and it says it applies Islam. And it applies it a very, very fundamentalist manner. It has been accused of gender apartheid. It has been accused of destruction of musical instruments. So consequently, as its adherence to a strict literal interpretive Islam is very high, we will say it is very high on the Islamostat. On the other hand, let's take the example of Saudi Arabia, where in 1979, some people might know, there was the seizure of the Grand Mosque, in which they had wanted the rebels, who ultimately all killed with the help of the French. They wanted a far more fundamentalist Saudi Arabia. And although they were killed, they succeeded because after the siege was suppressed, Saudi Arabia took a very conservative, turn. Women disappeared from televisions, and therefore they also started exporting, their ideology, all over the world. So in terms of Islamostat, what we saw after 1979 was an increase in the Islamostat of, Saudi Arabia. Now, what we have is, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he's trying in his own way, in a certain limited way, to turn the Islamostat down. He's talking about moderate Muslims. He specifically referred to the events of 1979. He says he want to become a moderate, normal country in which he has allowed women to, to drive and also to go for the Hajj without mahram, that is their close male relatives. So he's trying to turn the Islamostat down. When it comes to Pakistan, we find this is a country which has had an existential crisis, identity crisis right from the very beginning. It wanted to be Islamic, it wanted to be democratic, and it really hasn't figured out where its head or tail is. So therefore, it is a very confused country in terms of Islamostat, although there are liberal and hardline fanatical elements in this. But I put this concept forward to you of Islamostat as a simple, easy, intuitive way of understanding what is going on in these countries. So therefore, with this one measure of 1 to 10, you can say where the country is instead of all this confusing terminology of hard line, soft line, moderate, etc. So in terms of your question, as I said, everything is up in the air. And now we are also in the age of the internet. We are in the age of information. We are in the age of globalization, where knowledge has no boundaries, where it can instantly reach from one part of the world to another. And one only hopes, and I can say this as a former UN civil servant who believes in its ideal still of peace and coexistence, coming from a country which has been and remains an example of coexistence, that the ideals of peace and harmony will succeed. But I am under no illusions as to the kind of challenges before us, Vibhuti Ji. I'm sorry, you're muted.
That brings me to the third V of the Islamic strategy or tactic that they use. The first I talked about, they know how to play the vote bank politics. They also know that in the West we seek peace. We have a constitutional obligation for non-violence, but they resort to violence at the drop of a hat, right? And then the third one is the victimhood part, where they blame everybody else for their problems, whereas they say the solution lies with them. But they blame everybody else for their problem, and that is the result of the phobia. So in the United States, certain Congress people have tried to bring about the Islamophobia bill, which has not gone through. You earlier stated that the United Nations has clearly stated that making inquiries or questions about Islam is not Islamophobic.
Correct.
Yet, individual governments are trying very hard to bend backwards to accommodate them. So my question to you would be, are we complicit, or are we hoping against hope, or are we delusional, or are we expecting that some moderate or some liberal Muslim will make a change, but the book can't change? We know the story of Nupur Sharma and others in India who quoted from the text, and they got the call for fatwa. And now we have Zakir Naik, who goes to Pakistan, where there was an uproar for his statement of quoting the text of Islam, how the women need to be and how they have to be. And there was an uproar, and I applauded the Kashmiri response to Zakir Naik's statement. But when he quotes that Muhammad consummated the marriage at 9 years with Aisha, it's okay. But if you and I say, you don't have the right to say, and then there is phobic, and then there is a fatwa against you and I. How does one deal with that?
So we will have to deal with it with a very, very strong nerve and a very clear understanding of, first of all, we have to see what is the right thing to do. Right? What is the right thing to do? Now, this is actually easier than, what people think. And let me give an example. Enforcing of existing laws should not be controversial. Right? So the first thing which is required to deal with any minority, anyone outside, is to ask that you adhere to the law of the land. And consequently, that is an application of the law of the land. So the first lacuna, the first drawback, the first mistake, and the first omission which democratic countries make is to somehow give an exception to this, the adherents of this religion, that the laws of the land don't apply to them. For example, let us take the case of polygamy, right? Now, polygamy is formally condemned by the United Nations, right? And at the same time, it is said that it should be outlawed as soon as possible. Now, that's what the normative things state. It is illegal in the US, the UK, but at the same time, we find, and there are ample reports on this, on the spread of polygamy in Western countries, in UK, in which the complaints have come from Muslim women themselves. Now, the question is, why are these laws not being enforced? What is happening is that there is a gradual accommodation. They'll say, oh, well, the first wife, the second wife also deserves something, and therefore, you give her something. What has happened is a de facto recognition of polygamy. So my point is, are we enforcing the laws which are applicable? Now, again, if you have a look at United Nations, conventions, and I can dig about and tell you that aliens and they use the word aliens, that if you go to another country, you have the responsibility to adapt to the culture of that country. And consequently, you cannot expect that the culture of the country should adapt to you. So this is not my personal belief. This is written in international law. Now, when we go, for instance, to Islamic countries, they insist that you abide by our rules, that women cover up. In fact, there was an example of, I think, women from Germany or Sweden going to Iran, feminist, and they dutifully donned the hijab when they were meeting the leaders of the Islamic Republic. So if you say that you abide by a set of rules and that is applicable to everybody, including us and to you, that's the first step which is to be taken in both conceptual and practical terms in getting rid of this problem. But that is never done. Again, what I have said, there is nothing controversial. Application of the existing laws. Then after that, of course, we can come to more contentious things. For example, uh, you know uh, issues of things which are clearly against the law, uh, increased rates of criminality, etc. Those are more sensitive things. But the first thing is, let us enforce the law as it exists. And I cannot think of a better example than polygamy in India. Why is it legal for a Muslim man to marry four women, even though Muslim spokesman, I think it was the previous chief election commissioner, he says it's not a big deal for us and we should accept it because it is a small problem. And it's one thing to say, well, it is also applicable, it is also prevalent amongst Hindus. Well, it is, but it is illegal. So therefore, if you have one law for everybody, it is not discrimination. So that's the first step which is to be taken in this, Vibhutiji. Enforce the existing law.
Enforcing existing law. And I
Correct.
mean, recently you gave a talk. You gave a talk at India International Center, and you emphasized about the fact that the way, in a remarkable, deliberate, drip way, the Hindu population, the minority population in Pakistan has shrunk remarkably. And every day we hear stories about young girls captured, converted in a brutal way. There are enough number of videos to see about that. And they are converted against their will, and they are forced to ignominious activities.
Right.
Tell us about the evidence and whatever you want to share about that with the audience, because your India International Center talk is not a global element yet now. So I would want you to share
Right.
that.
So it is a very sorry state of affairs, Vibhutiji. And the fact is that we are looking at accomplished genocide in Pakistan. And the term which I have used, drip genocide, is not mine. It is the term used by a Pakistani academic, hats off to her, Farnahaz Isfahani. And she's written a book called Purifying the Land of the Pure, and which is on what happened to the minorities of Pakistan. And, and she clearly states that this has happened as a result of the desire of some to have a quote unquote purer Islamic state as Muhammad Ali Jinnah lay dying. This is what I'm quoting from her. So the totality of the evidence which I have gathered in this is that not only has there been a drastic decline in the population of Pakistan Hindus, they have not had a religion-based census since 1988. So therefore, we can only guess as to what is the precise number. But several devious and devilish tactics have been used to drive Hindus into the state in which they are in currently. Some of them, for instance, include the conversion of their women, of the girls. And once you convert a girl into a Muslim, by definition, she can no longer have a Hindu child. So consequently, this is expressly forbidden, that you cannot take children out of one community and give to another. You've had one of the most insidious and unknown ways in which this genocide has been accomplished is through putting hate in people's minds through the medium of school curriculum. Now, let me explain. There have been many studies done, and there have been articles written even in Pakistani newspapers like the Dawn, that the curriculums teach hate. So you've had researchers from the United States, Commission on International Religious Freedom, go out there, take samples of the textbooks, do a content analysis, and find that invariably the Muslim society is portrayed as superior, generous, whereas the culture of Hindus is portrayed as hateful, and degenerate, and that they should be grateful to the Muslims for what has been given to them. Now, when you include hate in a curriculum, that is the most surefire way of spreading hate throughout the society. And I think it bears emphasizing that when you have curriculums like this, they are not by chance Curriculums and textbooks, what is written in textbooks, is decided very deliberately by academic committees, signed off by ministers, used by teachers, and they are out in the open. So this is something which is a very insidious, in addition to attacks on the temples. Recently, for example, I think a couple of years ago, there were torrential rains in Pakistan, and the Hindus were actually denied help because they were Hindus, and they converted because they were offered help on the condition that they convert. Now, what can be more, shall I say, worthy of condemnation, that conversion which is made at the point of when a man and his family has been rendered helpless by the pitiless operation of nature, in which it is such an asymmetrical position of poverty that he has no alternative but to convert. And these are the mechanisms through which they have, decimated the Hindu population out there. Another thing which the people don't know about is something called the Enemy Properties Act. After the 1965 war, after they had got their hands burnt in the 1965 war, they enacted this. And this essentially was considering Hindus as agents of India, in which they used this to systematically dispossess the property of Hindus in Pakistan, leaving them penniless and absolute power, impoverished, along with the structure of the police, the judiciary, and the media, all conspiring to talk against Hindus, or at least minimizing them. So we are looking at practically an accomplished genocide, in which inexplicably the Indian government has now enacted hurdles in the way of Hindus in Pakistan who want to migrate to India. They have a cap of 2014, but it should have been an open-ended thing. When if Hindus of Pakistan want to migrate to India, they should be allowed to do so. And therefore, this is an inexplicable kind of obstacle which has been put in place, possibly by the Indian bureaucrats for reasons best known to them, but it's rather disheartening. So we are looking at a situation which forms a textbook example of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention of 1948, which prohibits certain acts, Vibhuti Ji.
You have, this is a fascinating conversation, and I'm 100% sure that we need to have more of this. Because the more we know, the more we can think about doing something about it. Because here is a very classic example, whereas they disenfranchise through an act to take away the enemy property. But in India, you have Waqf Act, which these people are saying that everything belongs to them. Although this community, unfortunately, is also an invader community. There's no difference between the Islamic invasion of India for a particular purpose and versus the East India Company. So we got freedom. Transfer of power happened in 1947, but have we actually achieved freedom? And that question comes to my mind. Because this is extremely important. This is my last question of the day, and we will continue this conversation, is knowing what we know. That's my favorite phrase. Knowing what we know now, what has happened in Bangladesh, whether it is a US regime change operation, but what we know now is that Bangladesh is becoming a radical Islamic country from what it was as under Sheikh Hasina. So the United States is accused, or it is implied that the United States played a role in installing Muhammad Yunus as the prime minister, acting caretaker prime minister, and Biden and Clinton, everybody hugging him. What must India do in this scenario? Because now they have declared Sheikh Hasina as an absconder and they want to have her back. So these people have the three V's I talk about: the vote bank, the violence, and the victimhood. They apply the three V's very cleverly. How does one counter that? What must India and Indians do and Hindus do?
Right.
Because we have enemies within.
So, when it comes to Bangladesh, I think what we need to understand is that in 1971, when we helped them get their independence, they were a secular country at that time. But unfortunately, what has happened is that we have been under the illusion that everything is fine for Hindus in Bangladesh because they are quote unquote a friendly country. Now, this is unfortunately not a case at all. Because again, the Enemy Properties Act, which was a part of Pakistan, they had the opportunity in Bangladesh also to repeal it, but they didn't, and they call it the Vested Property Act. So all the elements which have served as a downward squeeze on the Hindu population in Pakistan have, to a certain extent, also worked in Bangladesh. There have been a horrific series of massacres, kidnappings, rapes, which have been carried out on the Hindu community of Bangladesh. And this is the situation in terms of now we've had uh, a change of government which is brought about by violent circumstances. And it's very important for us, for Indians, to think about what we can do. So if I was in the lucky and rather improbable position of advising the Foreign Minister of India, here are some of the steps which I would consider him to take. So the first is that it is essential that we call on Bangladesh to have free, fair, and observable elections in the country. Now, what is that going to do? They are trying to put pressure on us by saying, hand over Sheikh Hasina. In a response, if we have a continuous and regular stand on this, that is, the government of Bangladesh must declare that it should have free and fair elections within the year, what is going to happen is it is going to put pressure on them, because inside there is going to be, and there is right now going on, a power struggle between the hardliners, between the political parties, between the students, and therefore there is always the attraction of a lot of money which is to be made with holding power. So when you say hold elections, we in India would have done three things. One, we would have reinforced our standing as the world's largest democracy for calling for elections, number one. Number two, we would have put a pressure on them, because if you want Sheikh Hasina, we can easily say, well, unfortunately, we cannot hand her over to you because your government is not a legitimate one, in the sense that it does not have the consent of the people of Bangladesh. So therefore, that is going to put pressure on them, because right now they're in a position to simply say, well, hand over Sheikh Hasina because she's committed war crimes, and therefore, put us in a embarrassing situation. The third is that Bangladesh is a country with many vulnerabilities. We surround them, and consequently, I think the time has come for us in India to set up, something which is a counter to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and to issue a formal report every year on Pakistan and Bangladesh and other countries where we have a strategic interest about what is the state of the minorities. And therefore, to have a specialized desk in the Ministry of External Affairs that monitors all the indicators of attacks against Hindus, their appointments in positions, and therefore they should know that we are not indifferent to this thing. Because this is not a distant battle, Vibhuti Ji. This is not something which is happening over the horizon and that has no chance of coming to India. And this is just a foretaste, once upon a time, obviously you cannot unroll the chariot of history, but once upon a time, there were plenty of, Hindus in Pakistan, they're gone. Similarly, it is there in Bangladesh. So we're looking at an ongoing decimation. There is a wonderful book by a gentleman called Belkin. It's in Bangladesh. There's a quiet cleansing of the Bangladeshi Hindus, which I suggested everybody has read. He's an American Jew, and I think I just got the book, and I cannot thank him enough. It's a brilliant book with a foreword by the Hindu America Foundation, Samir Kalra. So, number one, call for elections, free and fair. Keep repeating it. We will get the advantage because we will conform to the international rules and regulations, make clear to them that we have got ways of making sure that their Hindu community is not, discriminated against. So these are some of the ideas, as I said, if I was in the improbable position of advising Sri Jaishankar.
Thank you very much. It has been a fascinating conversation, and here is the element of politics that gets into. And the Western nations are famous for playing games with ourselves, within ourselves. So everybody knows it's no longer a secret that United States is doing in Bangladesh is primarily because Plan A of defeating Modi and replacing Modi with a more compliant leadership in India has failed because election produced a different result. Are they trying to do that via Bangladesh? Because whatever happened in Bangladesh, there were Indian politicians who are on record making a statement that what happened in Bangladesh can happen in India too, and Modi will have to go. So you are looking at complicity of major powers. I'm an Indian American. My government is doing this or not doing this. I would hope they will deny. You are an Indian American. You are an Indian as yet living in America. We all need to be concerned about that. We need to protect and value, defend what we cherish. And that is our values, our way of life, and that is a democratic way of life. So thank you very much for joining today. The viewers, remember my favorite phrase, knowing what you know, what must you do? Everybody wants to have truth prevail. Now, a very interesting thing. Vivek Ramaswamy has truth as his moniker, as his message. And so did Netanyahu say in his speech, truth, and he demanded reciprocity. Are we irresponsible? Certainly not. And that's
So
what is that
the
was
only,
happening.
sorry for interrupting. The one
Yeah.
last thing I'd like to say is that whatever we have discussed is within the bounds of law. We are
Yes.
asking for a universal application, not a discriminatory application, and therefore a universal application of law of the value of human life, of the freedom of women, cannot be considered Islamophobic by any means,
Yes.
because we are relying on the external criteria of universally accepted norms. And this cannot be emphasized enough, simply because this giant scream of Islamophobia arises from the atmosphere and tries to envelop us. But unfortunately, that must be defeated by the fact that we are talking about universally accepted norms.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Totally agree with you on that. So, ladies and gentlemen, viewers, thank you very much for watching today. As I always say, Satyameva Jayate, truth will triumph, truth must triumph, for truth alone triumphs. Interpret it any which way you want. But for truth to triumph, you got to stand up for it. You got to fight for it. Truth will not win on its own. So, thank you again. Please like, subscribe, and support our channel. Give your feedback. Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.